Hello everyone, Mr. Crow here with another Greenfoot lesson. We're doing a top-down shooter. We're on part 3. We have our character being able to move, remove the enemies from the world, and being able to remove our projectiles when they reach the edge of the screen. But we're firing our projectiles much too fast, so that's the first thing we're going to go in and fix. So if you don't open up your projectile code and go in there, we need to create a counter in our firing projectile that makes it so it doesn't constantly fire, that it fires at a little bit slower of a pace. So actually, instead of creating a variable, that is one option. We're actually going to make it so that in our player, where we're firing, the fire projectile method is, we're going to make it so that the Greenfoot is key down space has to be true, but we also need to make it not fire until Greenfoot dot is key down space is not true. So once you let go of the space bar, then you will be able to activate and be able to actually fire another projectile after you let go of the space bar. So we need to create what we call a Boolean, which is a true-false data type. So a Boolean can fire. We're going to start that off equaling true, because we can fire at first. And then if Greenfoot.isKeyDown space and can fire equals true, we are able to fire. And then after we add the object in, we can change can fire to false. And then that way, in our else if Greenfoot is key down space, if space bar is not down, we can switch can fire back to true, so then you are able to fire once again. That way, when we compile, instead of spawning hundreds at a time, you have to let go of the space bar before you're able to fire once again. Okay? And so now we're going to go into our enemy class and make it so that you have to hit more than one. Enemy 2 needs to be hit more than once. Right now, all it needs to do is get hit once, and that code is in our projectile. And sometimes you put the code in the wrong place, or we need to change up our code a little bit. So instead of having it get removed when our projectile hits the enemy, we're going to have our projectile get removed when the enemy touches the projectile, as opposed to the projectile touching the enemy. So we're just going to switch kind of where we have our information. So in enemy 1, we're going to create a public void hit by projectile method. And then if, well, first of all, let's paste what we had here. So instead of having the projectile hit the enemy, we're going to have the enemy, since we're in the projectile, or we're in the enemy code now. So if the enemy, intersects with the projectile class, projectile, we're going to remove object this, which this is now our enemy. And then we want to make sure first get world dot remove object projectile, that only the projectile that is intersecting the enemy, not just any old projectile. Okay? So now that we have been able to do that, we want to test and make sure that that is working correctly. So we run it. Now it's not going through it. It's because we forgot to do the most important thing, which is put it in the act method. Thank you. Thank you, Ryan. So we go back into our enemy 1, and hit by projectile needs to get put in the act method for it to even be able to work, because our act method is our main method. And now only enemy 1 will be able to be hit. Enemy 2 is still not being able to be hit, but we want to make sure the code is different, because we want our enemy 2, it'll be similar but different. We want our enemy 2 to have to be able to be hit twice. So we can copy the code from enemy 1, plug in that method for enemy 2. This is the same deal, but we're not actually going to remove we're going to remove the projectile. We're not going to remove this yet. We're going to need to create a variable that makes it so that it can count how many times it gets hit. So an integer variable, so int times hit equals 2. So we're going to set this variable to 2. And then times hit will minus minus. And then if times hit equals 0, get world dot remove object this. So now, first of all, this needs to be in the act method, so it actually happens. But now, if you look at the difference between the code from enemy 2 and enemy 1, enemy 2, if you get hit by the projectile, this variable is going to go down by 1, which is 2. It'll go down to 1 after the projectile gets hit or gets removed. And then if it gets hit again, it'll go down to 0, and then it'll check. If it's 0, it'll remove this object from the world. Now we test and make sure that Mr. Crow didn't mess it up. So hit once, hit twice, there we go. Now we're in business. Okay, next step is one of my favorites, is that we need to create a counter method. So to create a counter, to count how many times or how many enemies we've hit and destroyed. So we're going to create a counter. We don't need to set an image to it, because we're going to design our own image. So we're going to have the open editor, our counter, and since this counter is going to be changing, we're not going to put it in the constructor method. Since it's changing, we're going to put it in the act method. So we're going to do set image new Greenfoot image, and so we need to decide what we're going to create our image as. So we're going to set the image, and then we're going to create a new Greenfoot image, and then it's going to want the text. So score is going to be our text, and then comma text height, like something like 50. Just imagine in Word, if your text height was 50, it'd be big, but imagine a text height of 50 on your screen for your game. That's pretty decent size. And then it's going to ask for the foreground and the background, and then you're going to do color dot all caps for the foreground, and then background. And I hope I got this decently right. It's going to also need to have another parentheses right there, but also you're going to need to import colors, because Greenfoot doesn't necessarily automatically know colors. Maybe the newer version does. Okay, so if I put in the score counter, score, there we go. We got our score up. Okay, so why, does anyone know, why does counter, if you look at the code, oh, come on. Why does the counter show up as a green foot to start off? Green foot, and then once I run it, then the score comes up. Anybody got an idea?
In the act method, so it doesn't run until like the game starts.
Thank you, Jackson. It is because it's in the act method, and it won't run. Nothing will happen until that run method is pushed. Run button is pushed, excuse me. So we need to create a constructor, and we need to put the same thing in the constructor as the act method. But we're going to need something to be changing. So we have an empty blank for score. So we're going to create a variable for score. And we're going to set it equal to 0 to start off. And we're going to do a plus score. So whenever you add anything, and this is just Java language, if you're adding a variable to text, and you're adding in between text and variables, you're going to need to do a plus score. This plus will not literally show up, just the variable will show up. And so that way, score, now when we plug it in, score equals 0. And, you know, it's not automatically going to start changing our score, but at least we have our score collected and everything like that. So that's good that we have that started. Now, when we go into we need to go back into counter. So let's bring up the counter. Somewhere we have an error. We'll fix that error here in a minute. That bug. Okay, so we're going to go into our counter. Okay, so we open up our counter, and we are going to create a way, not our counter, we're going to open up our projectile and create a way for the projectile, when the projectile hits something, we're going to need to count. Or actually, excuse me, for us it's when the enemy gets hit by the projectile. Okay, so for enemy 1, let's just do the hit projectile for enemy 1. So you need to do a world, my world is what we're going to call our world, equals get world. So from now on, anytime we have get world, we've renamed it as my world, because it's just what you have to do. And then we need to do the name of the space. Actually, I'm going to lowercase world, and I'll tell you why here in a second. Because we need to do my world. So the name that you have given the world, which Greenfoot automatically gives you this my world.
Go closer, Mr. Crow.
So we've renamed our world, my world equals world. Nope. Equals my world. Make sure your capitalization is correct. This needs to match exactly what you have up here. And then the second world, I know it's confusing, needs to match this, whatever you've called this down here. Okay? Then you have a semicolon. Now we're using our counter. So we're going to do counter equals
have Wesley and Lillian Damron to the front office. Wesley and Lillian Damron to the front office, please.
okay. So now you need to have this first word match exactly what you have up here, because what we're doing is we're accessing for our enemy 1, we're going to access the counter every time the enemy gets hit by the projectile. We're going to go through our world, so the my world, and you're going to access your counter. Now we haven't given us the capability to do that quite yet, but we're about to. And then we're going to use, so now we have renamed the ability to access the counter class. We have renamed it lowercase counter. So then we're going to do lowercase counter dot add score. And we're going to create an add score method in our counter right now. So now we've created the ability to access the world, my world, the ability to access the counter through the world, and then we are using this add score method once we create this add score method in our counter. So now we're going to go to our counter and create the add score method, public void add score, and we're going to do score plus plus. So now every time we are in our enemy, when we hit the projectile, it's going to access information from the world. We're going to access the counter class from the world, and we're going to do the add score method, which is going to add 1 to our score every time our projectile hits the enemy. So now we have the counter, but what we need to do is go into our world and be able to access that counter. So our last thing that we have to do is do counter equals new counter, making it so that we have our object of a counter and we are able to access information from it. So we need to make it public counter get counter, and so that get counter is actually what allows you to access information from the counter. And what do we want to return? Well, we want to return this object counter up here with a semicolon. And I know this might look confusing, but this is just how you are able to access information between classes by going through your world. So know this. These are the sets of code that you need to access information between worlds. So when we go into our enemy 1, it's able to go through the world. Which world? Well, the my world, which is what we've called it right here. And we're able to access the counter information, and we're able to add score through the counter. So now, if I add in our counter, let's hope it works. It won't at first, actually, for a couple of reasons, actually. So it won't work because you need to add the counter in prior, and you need to add the counter in manually into the prepare method. So you need to add object. You cannot add it in and then save the world. You need to add object counter so that it accesses the counter that we're accessing information from. So this new counter up here is getting information access from it. So you need to add object counter at the location of, let's do 50, 50, which is going to be upper left corner, which is about where we want it anyways. So now, we're going to need to move it over on the X value a little bit. It still won't quite work because we have an error that pops up. So in our enemy 1, it's saying that it's removing an object. Let's look at the error that pops up. It says the error that pops up is actor not in world. Shoot. Actor not in world. An attempt was made to use the actor's location while it is not in the world. Either it has not been inserted or it has been removed. So in our case, our actor has been removed prior. So this object is removed, and then it's trying to get more code and information. Well, you need to make sure that this object is the last thing that's happening. Whenever you're removing an object from the world, that has to be the last thing that happens, because otherwise it'll keep trying to read code when the object's already removed from the world. So let's see if this works. Otherwise, we're going to need to debug it and figure out, our score's going up for enemy 1. Sweet. So we got our score going up. We probably can make our score text size a little bit smaller. 40 is probably a little bit more reasonable. We probably should relocate our counter a little bit further to the right on the X axis because it wasn't showing up all the way. That's a little bit better. And now we're going to add in the enemy 2 code. So the enemy 2 gets removed. Oh, I noticed the world stopped. There must be another error. Okay, so in enemy 1, the error happened when this object hit the bottom of the screen. It'll freeze. So I know that that's where my error, that's where the problem is. So you guys gotta understand how to debug your own code. Okay, what's the best way to do it? What do you need to look for? So this is saying the remove enemy, which we have in the superclass. So remove enemy. So if it gets to 599, it'll remove object this. We need to do an if statement, an if else. So if remove enemy at the bottom of the screen, else hit projectile. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're actually going to take it out of the superclass. I know it's more efficient to have it in the superclass, but sometimes you need to change it up a little bit. So we're going to copy this code, and we're actually going to paste it here and do an else if. So if the enemy 1 hits projectile, it'll remove object projectile, add to the score, and then it will remove object this. Otherwise, if it doesn't hit the projectile, it will only read this code. That's why it doesn't get confused if you do an else if. So usually if actor's not in the world, it's getting removed at some point, and you might need to do an else if, or you might need to move the remove object to the bottom of your code. So now, if this hits the edge of the screen, code keeps running. We're still good to go. But if the second enemy, because we haven't put that code into the second enemy, it'll still have a problem. So now I'm going to copy and paste the essential information from enemy 1 into enemy 2, except our enemy 2 is a little bit different, so I'm going to change it up actually. So these are both in there. I've hit projectile twice. So I'm going to copy. I'm going to copy all the way to remove object, but we're removing an object at a different time. So we're still going to remove the projectile. We're still going to count how many times you're hit and count that down. And we're still only removing object if it's equals 0. Okay? So we can get rid of this.
What bottom of the screen?
Excuse me?
Are you still missing the bottom of the screen stuff?
Yes, you're correct. Absolutely right, Ryan. So I have the bottom of the screen stuff, meaning the remove enemy method, in my superclass, my enemy superclass. And I need to actually get rid of this, copy it. I'm going to copy it. I don't need it up there anymore because I'm going to put it individually in. And then I'm going to do an if times hit equals 0, remove object then. Else if what? Else if get y is at the bottom of the screen stuff, then I'll remove object this. So here are my two ways of getting removed from the world, either by getting hit or hitting the bottom, and I'm getting points for my second enemy every time I hit them, so they'll give me twice as many points. If you guys want to add a boss in that makes it so you have to hit it 4 or 5 times and the enemy moves a little bit slower maybe, you guys know how to do that. But that will be the end of part 3 of top-down shooter game. Next time we're going to be adding in a health bar if they reach the end of the screen, and also a timer. So thanks for watching. Go ahead and smash that like button. My students were begging me to add that to my video. So go ahead, smash that like button, smash that subscribe button, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.